Okay, think about this for a second. The United States was literally born from a revolution against an empire. The whole idea was liberty, self-government, all that good stuff. And yet, somehow, by the turn of the 20th century, America found itself with its own overseas empire. So how in the world did that happen? How does a country built on anti-colonial ideals become a colonial power itself? Well, let's get into it.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? It's this huge paradox at the heart of American history. And the story behind it? It's a wild mix of good intentions, really bad unintended consequences, a ton of fierce debate, and one surprisingly short war that would change America's place in the world forever.
All right, so our story really kicks off just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, in Cuba. At the time, Cuba was deep in a brutal fight for independence from Spain. But what dragged the United States into this mess wasn't careful diplomacy. Oh no, it was the raw, unfiltered, and totally unrestrained power of the press.
So picture this. It's the 1890s, and you've got these two newspaper titans, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, locked in this no-holds-barred slugfest for more readers. They figured out a pretty shocking formula. The more sensational the stories, the more dramatic the drawings of Spanish cruelty in Cuba, whether they were completely true or not, the more papers they sold. This crazy, fact-bending style of reporting got a name: yellow journalism.
This legendary quote, which may or may not have actually been said by Hearst, tells you everything you need to know about the mood of the time. The press wasn't just reporting the news anymore, it was actively shaping it. It was pouring gasoline on the fire of public outrage, making war feel not just possible, but absolutely necessary.
And then, the spark. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine just explodes in Havana Harbor, killing over 260 American sailors. The Yellow Press didn't wait for facts. They immediately blamed Spain, with headlines basically screaming for blood. A U.S. naval investigation later concluded it was probably an external mine, and that was all the public needed to hear. The pressure on the government became immense. And yet, even as Congress authorized war, they passed something called the Teller Amendment, which was an explicit promise that the U.S. had zero intention of annexing Cuba. This was supposed to be a war of liberation, remember that?
So the war that followed was incredibly short and, for the U.S., incredibly successful. But what happened next? The outcome was way more complicated and controversial than almost anyone saw coming. Secretary of State John Hay famously called it a splendid little war. And, from a certain military perspective, he wasn't wrong. In less than 4 months of fighting, the once mighty Spanish Empire was brought to its knees. Its navy was shattered from the Caribbean all the way to the Pacific. So the two sides met in Paris to hammer out the terms of surrender.
And the Treaty of Paris that came out of those talks completely redrew the map. Spain had to give up its claim to Cuba. It formally handed over Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. But the biggest prize, and by far the most controversial one, was the entire Philippine archipelago, a nation of millions of people on the other side of the globe. And what was the price tag for this massive new territory, you ask? The United States paid Spain $20 million. And just like that, the nation born from an anti-colonial revolution suddenly owned colonies. So, the war with Spain might have been over, but a brand new conflict erupted almost instantly, this time inside the United States itself. This question of what to do with these new lands sparked this furious, soul-searching debate across the entire country.
Right at the center of the opposition was a new group, the American Anti-Imperialist League. And their argument was incredibly simple and powerful. It went right back to the Declaration of Independence. To rule over other people without their consent, they said, was a complete betrayal of America's most fundamental ideals.
And this debate got fierce. On one side, you had the imperialists talking about huge commercial opportunities, national power, and this so-called duty to extend Christian civilization. But the anti-imperialists fired right back, arguing that this was a dark path that would lead to moral ruin for the nation, and that it completely rejected the ideal of self-government that America was supposed to stand for.
And listen, this opposition was not some fringe movement. We're talking about a who's who of famous Americans. Author Mark Twain, the industrialist Andrew Carnegie, former President Grover Cleveland, the labor leader Samuel Gompers. These were heavy hitters who saw this as a genuine threat to the American Republic.
And nobody, I mean nobody, captured that moral outrage with more biting wit than Mark Twain. In this scathing piece of satire, he suggested that the new American flag for the Philippines should have its white stripes painted black and the stars replaced with a skull and crossbones. To him, American imperialism wasn't just bad policy, it was basically the creed of a pirate.
So while Americans were having this huge debate back home, the real world, often brutal consequences of their country's victory were playing out on the ground in Cuba and the Philippines. That promise of liberation was about to crash head-on into the cold reality of military occupation.
The father of Cuban independence, José Martí, once said, "To change masters is not to be free," and his words turned out to be tragically prophetic. For the many Cubans who had fought for decades to be free from Spain, the American arrival started to feel less like liberation and more like they were just trading one boss for another.
You can see how systematic the process was. First, the Cuban commanders who did most of the actual fighting, they were completely shut out of the surrender talks with Spain. Next, a U.S. military government took over, pushing the existing Cuban government to the side. Then, the Cuban Revolutionary Army, the very people who had nearly won the war, were basically paid off to just disband. The journey from ally to occupier was unbelievably fast.
And before the U.S. military would even consider leaving, it forced Cuba to write something called the Platt Amendment directly into its new constitution. This gave the U.S. the legal right to intervene in Cuban business whenever it wanted, and secured a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay. So yeah, Cuba was independent, but America's control was literally written into Cuban law.
But as messy as things were in Cuba, what happened in the Philippines was an absolute tragedy. Filipino revolutionaries had fought alongside the Americans to get rid of Spain. They had already declared their own independent republic. They thought they had earned their freedom. So when it became brutally clear that the Americans weren't going anywhere, a new war broke out. And this was no Splendid Little War. It was a gruesome, years-long war of conquest that would end up costing hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives.
So that Splendid Little War lasted just a few months, but its consequences, its legacy, would echo for generations. It didn't just change America's map, it forced a massive reckoning with the nation's own identity.
I mean, just look at this chart. It puts everything into perspective. Before 1898, America was basically contained to the North American continent. After 1898, the United States was a true global power, with territories stretching from the Caribbean all the way to the other side of the Pacific.
But here's the part that is just mind-blowing. The Treaty of Paris, the very document that made this empire official, passed in the U.S. Senate by a single vote. Just one. America's turn toward empire wasn't some grand national agreement. It was a decision made on an absolute razor's edge.
During that heated debate, an anti-imperialist senator named George Hoar offered this really chilling prophecy. He warned that this treaty would turn the American Republic into just another commonplace empire, changing its very nature from a nation of equals to a nation of rulers and subjects.
And that leaves us with the question that has been echoing ever since. Was this moment the triumph of American power and influence, or was it a fundamental betrayal of its own founding ideals? That tension between global ambition and the principle of self-government would go on to define the next century of American history. And you know what? It's a debate that, in a lot of ways, we're still having today.